The content of this video will present a cultural and cultural profile of the Bosnian-Herzegovinian Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Book by Noel Malcolm, Bosnia, A Short History, remains the best work on history of that contested land in English, unfortunately, since this book has a few significant virtues and, alas, numerous faults. More about Malcolm's book can be seen in this video, which contains a critical review of Malcolm's history of Bosnia. The following wording is mainly from the scientific paper of Jaja from 2012, published in Croatian Studies Review, in English, and it is available here. Also, it is supplemented by texts based on numerous articles and books in Croatian, Serbian, Bosnian, English, and German. We will call Bosnia and Herzegovina by the shorter name, Bosnia.
We will provide a synthetic account of the history and culture of the Croats in modern-day Bosnia and Herzegovina. The main aim of the video is the historical reconstruction of the genesis of the Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Its starting point can be found in the early Middle Ages, to which the history of the majority of modern European nations stands in continuity. It will further follow the history and culture of the Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina through the Ottoman period, their positioning towards modern national movements in the 19th century and the ideologies of the 20th century. We will use historical periods in a way it is shown on the screen. Illyrian period, until the creation of the Croatian and Serbian people in Southeast Europe in the 7th century. Medieval Bosnia and Huam, until the mid-15th century. Bosnian Catholics in the Ottoman Islamic confessional paradigm, until the 19th century. Bosnian Croats and modern national movements in the 19th century until 1918. Bosnian Croats and the ideologies of the 20th century, which we can divide in the following subchapters: in Yugoslav Kingdom from 1918 until 1941, during the Second World War from 1941 until 1945, in Socialist Yugoslavia from 1945 until 1991, during the Breakup of Yugoslavia from 1991 until 1995. And in Dayton, Bosnia and Herzegovina from 1995 until nowadays.
There are few cultural assets we need to have in mind to be able to intellectually move through the cultural history of Bosnia. We can see these assets on this figure. Ancient Bosnian culture in the form of tombstones. Religions in Bosnia: Catholic Church, Bosnian Church, Orthodox Church, Judaism, Islam and Communism. Scripts in Bosnia: Latin, Western Cyrillic or Croatian Cyrillic, Glagolitic and Arabic script. Language types in literature: Latin language, Croatian redaction of Old Church Slavonic, Serbian redaction of Old Church Slavonic, Croatian literature in vernacular, Islamic literature in Arabic language, Islamic literature in Slavic language. Dialectal language distribution: Western Shtokavian, Shakavian, and Eastern Shtokavian. In this figure we can see the Croatian language system as a whole, so, not only in Bosnia. We should have in mind that Croatian has 3 dialects and 4 language types in vernacular literature based on these dialects, in the beginning, based on Old Church Slavonic, and also with the influence of Latin on grammaticology. Dominant language types in Bosnia were Latin, Croatian redaction of Old Church Slavonic, and Croatian vernacular literature in West Shtokavian. What is still debatable is whether Bosnian pre-Ottoman literary culture in Church Slavonic is a part of Croatian heritage, or does it possess enough characteristic features to be considered a separate recension, Bosnian, different from Croatian, Serbian, Bulgarian, or Russian redactions. Serbian philologists try, constantly, to ascribe that literary corpus, from the 12th to the 15th centuries, to the Serbian literary canon, an effort that has virtually no substantiation in the language type and cultural physiognomy. In this figure we can see the Serbian dialectal language system. It has two dialects, as the two dialectal areas, Eastern Shtokavian and Torlak. There is high mutual intelligibility between Serbian East Shtokavian and Croatian West Shtokavian dialect. But Serbian literature in vernacular appeared in the 19th century, and Serbian literature until then is not intelligible to the Croatian reader, and not even to the modern Serbian reader. Also, Serbian culture was, in comparison to Croatian culture, only marginally in touch with the Latin language. Regarding scripts, Croats used Western Cyrillic script, Serbs used Serbian Cyrillic script. Along with Cyrillic script, Croats in general used Glagolitic script and Latin script.
Let's say something about modern national narratives in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Three ethnic groups reside in today's Bosnia and Herzegovina: the Bosniaks, Croats and Serbs, which are defined in the Constitution of Bosnia as constitutive nations and not as national majorities and minorities. Similar political architecture exists, for example, in Belgium and Switzerland, as opposed to one nation, one state countries, like the United States of America and France. Contemporary standard languages among these three groups rest on a common linguistic foundation and are mutually very close. In spite of their linguistic closeness, they are mutually differentiated by separate cultural and political identities and have different national narratives. You can find a sociolinguistic analysis of these languages in this video in English, and about the historical development in this video. Each one of those national narratives emphasizes the originality of one's own ethnic group on the territory of Bosnia and projects it into the distant past, while the presence of the remaining two ethnic groups is more or less marginalized and interpreted as an import from outside, in other words, as the product of centuries-old foreign influences in Bosnia.
The first national narrative to arise was the Serbian. During the westward and northward expansion of Serbs and Serbianized Vlachs under the aegis of the Ottoman authorities in the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries, the growth of confessionally defined Serbian proto-national consciousness began to crystallize among the patriarchs and higher echelons of the Orthodox clergy in their titles, as well among Serbian monks on their travels in Russia and other lands, resulting in sporadic proclamations of the entire South Slavic area as Slavano-Serbian, with the emerging narratives on Bosnian and Croatian historic lands as supposedly Serbian regions, relegating their non-Serbian population to an unenviable position of deficient Serbs of the Roman Rite or Croatian Bosnian Catholics and, as the other branch, Islamicized Orthodox Christians. One should mention that this was a development of the late 18th century. At the turn of the 19th century, the Enlighteners and national ideologists, Dosity Obradović and particularly Vuk Karadžić, the Serbs, all and everywhere, provided this pan-Serbian idea with a linguistic basis, proclaiming the majority of the South Slavic linguistic idioms as the Serbian language, and their speakers as Serbs. This ideology was not autochthonous, because, prior to the late 18th and early 19th century, Slavic studies of Dobrovsky, Shafarik, and Kopitar, and its misconceptions, linguistically defined Serbdom was not an issue among the Orthodox in Bosnia and everywhere where Serbs had settled outside of Serbia proper. Actually, Serbs abhorred everything written in the 400 years Shtokavian vernacular, liturgical and secular literary tradition, as something Croatian or Dalmatian, Catholic and poisonous, utterly dangerous for Serbian national and cultural identity. After the establishment of the Principality of Serbia in 1830, Serbian politics, through its project of Greater Serbia, views the Western Balkans as Serbian. The Greater Serbian project received its clearest expression in the work, named Outline, of Ilija Garashanin in 1844, and in the brochure, The Annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Serbian Problem, published 1908 in Belgrade. The author of this brochure, Jovan Cvijić, the leading name of Serbian science in that period, defined Bosnia as the core soil and heart of the Serbian people, in a similar manner as the Moscow region is for Russia. During the 20th century, the Greater Serbian national narrative, according to which Bosnia is the central province of the Serbian people, experienced, for sure, Yugoslavist accommodations, but Serbian Yugoslavism, in its core, retained a Greater Serbian character. This especially came to expression on the occasion of the collapse of Tito's Yugoslavia, in the late 20th century. At that time, the Serbian side imposed upon particular parts of the Yugoslav Federation the option of war, and the bloody breakdown of the Yugoslav state, instead of a civilized separation.
The argumentation of the Serbian national narrative rests on the great linguistic closeness and similar elements in folk culture of particular ethnic groups of the South Slavic world. This great linguistic similarity has been transformed into the thesis of a uniform linguistic identity, so that the Serbian side worked on the Serbianization of linguistic culture in Croatia, and, in particular, in Bosnia, from the time of Karadzic's work, The Serbs, All and Everywhere, to the breakdown of Yugoslavia. This project under the appellation of Serbo-Croatism also found a responsive chord in international linguistics, which even today, in considerable part, persists with its Serbo-Croatist attitudes, by which the Bosnian or Bosniak, Croatian, and Serbian standard languages are being joined into one language. German linguist and Slavicist Leopold Orbiger described the ideology of Serbo-Croatism thus: the perception of closeness creates the illusion of sameness.
Efforts were made to neutralize the remaining cultural and political differences by stressing the importance of folk culture and proclaiming as foreign all cultural and political traditions which were not able to fit into the Greater Serbian project. This project failed because Croatian and Serbian literatures, both liturgical and secular, differ in the past 800 to 1000 years, and, while Croatian literature and standard language have roots in the 500 years old urban Western Shtokavian writing, combined with Shakavian and Kajkavian features, and, modeled upon European humanist and Renaissance traditions, Serbian literature, based mostly on rural Eastern Shtokavian speeches, with Russian Slavonic imports, possesses a different physiognomy embedded in its 200 years old tradition. Nevertheless, especially during the communist Yugoslavia period, from 1945 to 1991, official language in Bosnia was strongly Serbianized through the media and school system, imposing characteristically Serbian traits in vocabulary, technical terminology, syntax and stylistics, with Bosnian Muslims indifferently following the dominant Serbian cultural hegemony, which collapsed only during the Yugoslav wars after 1991.
The remaining two Bosnian constitutive peoples, the Bosnian Croats and Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks, opposed the Serbian reading of the cultural and political identity of Bosnia with their own national narratives as antipodal projects. The Croatian national narrative on Bosnia as an exclusively Croatian land developed on the heels of the Greater Serbian narrative and received its final formulation at the turn of the 20th century. The Croatian narrative, which has rather complex and contradictory proto-national roots in the 16th century, in humanist reading of the older historical sources which mixed Illyrian, Croatian, mythized Gothic and Slavic ideological narratives in the work of Vinko Pribojević, did not build its argumentation upon the thesis of the sameness of the language and folk culture, but, rather on historic right and dominant early historical sources, according to which medieval Bosnia and its population belonged not to the Serbian, but to the Croatian demographic, cultural and political sphere. Owing to the Ottoman conquests, a large portion of the medieval Bosnians were Islamicized, while a numerous Serbian Orthodox population settled in Bosnia at the same time. While, according to the Croatian narrative, the Islamicized Bosnians, or Ottoman Bosnians, preserved the consciousness of their own supposedly Croatian affiliation, the immigrant Serbs, as members of the Serbian Orthodox Church, retained their non-Bosnian Serbian political and cultural traditions. After the retreat of the Ottoman Empire, the 400-year-old Ottoman rule in Bosnia left in its wake Catholic Croats, Muslim Croats and the settled Serbs. In 1992, the Croatian side renounced the Croats of the Islamic faith in Bosnia, proclaimed the Croatian constitutive people in Bosnia as the diaspora of the Republic of Croatia, and toyed with the idea of political division of Bosnia, as did the other two sides. Since the middle of the 17th century, the Vatican has considered the Catholic population of today's Republic of Croatia and today's Bosnia and Hercegovina to be members of the same nation. So, the Vatican did not include Slovenes, who are also Slavs and Catholics, and didn't even consider Serbs as members of the Eastern Orthodox Church. Culturally and historically, Croats were the sole inheritors of Saint Jerome's legend as the founder of Glagolitic script and the patriarch of Slavic language in the Roman province of Dalmatia. It could be said that this provision applies only to Catholics from the mentioned area. Slovenes and Serbs were excluded for obvious cultural and ecclesiastical reasons, and the name for this nation was specified to be Illyrian, which is equivalent to the modern perception of the Croatian nation if we substitute the Illyrian name with Croatian. Namely, the Supreme Ecclesiastical Court in Rome, St. Rhoda, in the judgment of April 24, 1656, ruled as follows: "We say, we declare, we judge, we determine and declare, that as a true and real province of the Illyrian people, it was, and is, and that is meant to be Dalmatia or Illyricum, which are parts of Croatia, Bosnia and Slavonia, and that only those who come from the said four regions, Dalmatia, Croatia, Bosnia and Slavonia, can be admitted to canonical places and ecclesiastical benefices of the same congregational church, as well as to the hospitality and brotherhood of the same Saint Jerome."
The national narrative of the Bosnian Muslims, officially declared as Bosniaks in 1993, was born in the shadow of the Serbian and Croatian narratives. The Bosniak side resisted the tendencies of Serbianization and Croaticization by building against these stereotypes its own historical picture, in which a continuity was postulated between the medieval Bosnians, called Bošnjani, and Ottoman Bosniaks, called Bošnjaci, between the so-called Bosnian Bogomils, as the members of the medieval Bosnian Church were known in the 19th century, and the Islamic community in Bosnia and, finally, between the medieval Bosnian kingdom and the Ottoman Bosnian Heirle founded in 1580. One of the Bosniak ideologists, Enver Imamović, in 1992 in the Bosniak parliament stated that it would be a hard task to convince Muslim population in Bosnia that their ancestors were called by the names of pre-Ottoman Christian rulers of Bosnia, for example Katarina and Stjepan. And also, during the breakup of Yugoslavia, only Bosnian Croats named their military forces after pre-Ottoman Bosnian rulers, dukes, bands and kings. In the search for deeper roots, the Bosniak side did not stop at the early Middle Ages, as did the Serbian and Croatian national narratives, but projected the existence of its ethnos into the Roman and Illyrian period, and by doing so, equated the antiquity of the Bosniaks with that of the ancient Greeks. The presence of Croats and Serbs in Bosnia was interpreted as a marginal phenomenon of Bosnian history, namely, the Serbs and Croats appear in the Bosniak narrative, according to Alicic, as small groups that dropped into Bosnia who knows under what conditions, and with what aims.
Of course, this is a rough sketch that should be enunciated in much more detailed terms. An historical excursus into Croatian integrative ideologies from the 19th century on should suffice. There have been two national ideologies: pure Croatian, essentially secular liberal nationalism, indifferent to religious identity and religiosity as such; another was Yugoslav Croatian ideology. Frequently, those two integrative ideologies oscillated, and individuals have been, as time and events had been passing, tossed between these two camps, or trying to synthesize both worldviews or ideologies. Croatian writer Miroslav Krleža, for instance. Roughly, pure Croat ideologues were soft on Muslims, while Yugoslav Croatian intellectuals were soft on Serbs, and others vacillated between these two positions. Interestingly enough, Franciscan friars and historians Krunoslav Draganović and Dominik Mandić belonged to pure pan-Croatian ideology, trying to nationally assimilate Bosnian Muslims into Croatdom, and simultaneously refusing to work on religious conversion of Muslims, a strange phenomenon, considering they were Catholic priests and monks. It seems that for them, nationality was more important than religion, a walking contradiction.
Then, from the beginning of their national individuation at the end of the 19th century, Bosnian Muslims, the majority of them, did not feel they belonged to either Croats or Serbs, simply because true nations cannot participate in two or more religious cultural civilizations. True, many Muslim intellectuals, from 1879 to 1945, identified either as Croats or Serbs, but they did not constitute more than 1 to 3% of Muslim population. The vast majority of Bosnian Muslims knew, in their heart of hearts, that they were not Croats or Serbs. A more serious Bosnian Muslim national individualization began during communist Yugoslavia, when they were finally recognized by communist authorities as a separate nation, not just a shapeless ethnic group. The majority of Bosnian Muslims were rather secularized, but the identitarian core of that people was Ottoman Islamic, and not secular Turkish along reforms of Kemal Pasha Ataturk, nor Bosnian in their cultural historical identifications, because the Ottoman conquest had destroyed historical memory of the old Bosnian kingdom, which remained, to a certain extent, only among Bosnian Catholic people who are, from this vantage point, the only true Bosnians who had fused historical identity and collective memory, particularly among Franciscans, while among the Orthodox people in Bosnia, there was no emotional connection with anything historically pre-Ottoman Bosnian, due to the Catholic character of most of the old Bosnian polity.
Thus, historically, from the 15th to the 19th centuries, two Bosnian identities have remained, having virtually nothing to do with each other, one among Catholics, who saw themselves as true heirs of old Bosnia, and wanted to get rid of Islam and Turks and have been trying to unify Bosnia with Catholic or Christian Europe, and in this instance with their co-ethnics in Croatia. Another Bosnian identity was that of Bosnian Muslims, who differentiated between themselves as Bosnian Turks, possessing regional Bosnian identity, and real Turks from other parts of the Ottoman Empire. Needless to say, these two Bosnian identities did not interweave, and had nothing in common regards cultural historical memory and political economic goals. Serbs in Bosnia have been formed in the mold of Serbian Orthodoxy. They did not possess any recognizable Bosnian identity, their culture being primarily Serbian and Orthodox Christian, with Bosnian historical associations serving, sometimes, only as a regional catalyst for modern Serbian Orthodox national integration. As far as Bosnian Croats go, their pride as self-conscious inheritors of the glory of the old Bosnian polity sometimes decelerated, slowed and hindered their final crystallization and integration in the modern Croatian nation.
One can see from the preceding paragraphs that all three Bosnian national narratives have been established on postulations regarding the antiquity and continuous settlement on Bosnian soil of one's own ethnic group. Arguments for such historical constructs were sought after by the Serbian side, as already mentioned, above all in a common linguistic basis, and similarities in the area of folk culture, by the Croatian side in the postulated political and cultural connection of the Bosnian-Herzegovinian area, with Croatian regions during the Middle Ages and later. The alleged consciousness of this community amongst the Bosnian Muslims survived the 400-year Ottoman period because its rule was foreign. Their integration into the modern Croatian nation was expected, as a logical consequence, because the Bosnian Muslims, according to this myopic idea, through their conversion to Islam, only changed their religious affiliation, but not their alleged Croatian cultural and political identity, or, in Serbian narrative, Serbian cultural and political identity. The Bosnian Muslims opposed this Croatian and Serbian reading of the history of Bosnia, through postulations about the continuity between medieval Bosnian and Ottoman political and religious institutions, between the Bosnian Kingdom and the Ottoman Bosnian Airlay, and between the Bosnian Church and the Islamic community. With regard to the medieval Bosnian Church, the Bosniak side has speculated and speculates about its allegedly greater theological similarities with Islam than with the established Christian churches, in order to further separate that institution from its Christian text and context, and so establish a direct continuity between medieval Bosnians, Bošnjani, and Ottoman Bosniaks, Bošnjaci. These ahistorical projections completely fail, because Bosnian church teachings had nothing in common with Islam, which actually destroyed the culture of that religious sect. Also, Islamization, wars, and succeeding population transfers sucked, in what is now Bosnia, most Islamized Croats, Serbs, Montenegrins, Albanians, Hungarians, Bulgarians, Vlachs. So, there is neither demographic nor cultural uninterrupted continuity between contemporary Bosniaks and medieval Bosnians.
Alongside the postulation of the continuity with the distant past, it is noticeable that all three narratives have pushed to the margins the profound demographic changes, above all, the numerous migrations and evictions from Bosnia during the Ottoman Wars, while the complex process of Islamization has been reduced to a question of conversions from Bogomilism, a misattributed appellation for Bosnian Church, to Islam. All in all, Bosnian national narratives are a classic example of Benedict Anderson's thesis on nations as imagined communities and Eric Hobsbawm's thesis on invented tradition, and they emerged as an ideological product of political projects that were tested in Bosnia at the time of its entry into modern history. Historiography stands before the task of deconstructing these constructs, to make clear their imaginary character, in other words to show, through an argumentative reconstruction of history, real historical hypotheses which must be taken into consideration, before creating a common political and cultural life amongst the heterogeneous communities of Bosnia.
Let's move to the medieval Bosnia and Huam. Departing from the preceding contextual problem, the remaining part of this video is devoted to the historical reconstruction of the genesis of the Bosnian Croats. Its starting point can be found in the early Middle Ages, to which the history of the majority of today's European nations stands in continuity. Only 3 narrative sources, on the South Slavic lands in the early Middle Ages, have been preserved. The first of these, which is cited under the title De Administrando Imperio, was composed in the middle of the 10th century, and ascribed to the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, that is 300 years after the beginning of the settlement of the South Slavs, in their new homeland. With regard to these Slavic settlers, Porphyrogenitus speaks of the Croats and Serbs under their names, which they brought from the proto-homeland, while the remaining Slavs are mentioned under tribal or regional names, for example, Zaklamoi, Turbuniates, Canalites, Diocletians, Arantanoi, while the Bošnjani or Bosnians are not mentioned. The second narrative source is dedicated to the history of the Church of Salona, modern Solin, and later split from Roman times to 1266. It was written by Thomas, the Archdeacon of Split, who lived in the 13th century, in the work Historia Salonitana. Thomas calls the Croats Goths, and speaks much of the relations between the autochthonous Roman and newly settled Slavic or Croatian element through 600 years, while he mentions Bosnia only in passing. Historiography dates the emergence of the third narrative source, known under the name the Chronicle of the Priest of Dioclea, or the Genealogy of Bar, to the second half of the 12th century. The text is very complex, and a critical analysis of it points to a number of paradigms. The mediated information is frequently very nebulous, and not one piece is dated. For this reason, this source is ideal for speculation and desirable constructs of the distant past. The furthest to go in this direction, on the Croatian side, was Dominik Mandić, Muhammad Haji Jahić on the Bosniak side, and Relija Novaković on the Serbian, as well as, of course, their publicistic epigones. Each of them made a particular effort to reconstruct a still wider political space for their own ethnic groups, Croatian, Bosniak, Serbian, in the early Middle Ages.
In the newest period, spanning through the last 3 to 4 decades, these sources have been submitted to sometimes devastating critiques and works of preeminent Croatian and Serbian historians who oscillate between two extremes: on one hand, younger, and in some cases, older generation of Croatian historians tend to look on them either as imaginative historical fictions, and hence only documents of Croatian and Serbian growth of proto-national consciousness, or mythic narratives creatively transcribed from other European sources. On the other hand, critical Serbian historians are trying to salvage basic elements of these works, unsure which part of these sources should be treated as relatively reliable and which is a pure fiction. The most important names are authors Mladen Ančić, Daniel Gino, Neven Budak, Tibor Živković, Ljubomir Gadić. Bosniak historians have, generally, not participated in heated discussions on those topics. What remains undisputed is that the first 400 years of Slavic-speaking peoples' migrations in what are now Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, and Serbia remain widely open to discussions and criticism due to lack of significant sources, which is not the case with the early French, English, or Scandinavians. The remaining historians accepted the information from the 3 aforementioned narrative sources as starting points for further research, but they introduced less conjecture into them and preferred to leave them as informative torsos. They filled those gaps, which could be confirmed or corrected with meager facts, mediated through other sources, archaeological remains, and marginal records. In recent times, this approach has been applied with the scientific precision and persuasiveness craved for by the Croatian philologist, Indo-Europeanist, and literary historian, Radoslav Karadzic. In his classical work, Literarum Studia, on which he worked for nearly 20 years, Karadzic succeeded in reconstructing the developmental lines of early medieval Croatian cultural history. To be sure, due to the scarcity of preserved historical sources, Kardicic's synthesis also has not ceased being a torso, but the main lines have acquired clear contours.
Kardicic systematically follows the centuries-old cultural coalescing between what he calls the indigenous Roman element and the settled Slavic or Croatian element on the eastern Adriatic coast. This cultural process lasted until humanism and the Renaissance in the 15th century. Even in the 15th century, debate in the political bodies of the Republic of Dubrovnik was conducted in Ragusian, a Romance language, while the last original speaker of the Vigliat, the Romance idiom on the island of Kirk, died in 1898. The baptizing of the Croats began immediately after their settlement in the 7th century, issuing from the Romance Dalmatian towns, which were under the supreme political rule of Byzantium, but belonged to the Roman Church in an ecclesiastical and cultural sense. At the beginning of the 9th century, Carolingian missionaries, most probably originating from Aquileia, participated in the baptizing of the Croats. They made use of popular Slavic elements in their catechisms, and in doing so, prepared the soil for Cyrillo-Methodian Christianization and culture, which will receive completely clear outlines from the second half of the 9th to the 11th century. In that way, the Croatian bilingual, Latin and Slavic culture, employing 3 alphabets, Latin, Glagolitic and Cyrillic, was born and further developed, a unique example in European relations. 4. It is not a question of the parallel existence of an erudite Latin education, and the popular language of the illiterate, which is otherwise characteristic for the European West, but rather, of 2 equally erudite and schooled literary traditions.
How did things stand in that respect with neighboring Bosnia? When Bosnia is in question in this context, it should be emphasized that Bosnia was less exposed to the permanent influences of the Dalmatian Roman towns because it was situated in the hinterland. Nevertheless, the meager records on the influence of the Salonitan Metropolitan on the ecclesiastical organization in Bosnia are confirmed by the archaeological remains of churches on the territory of today's Bosnia, which derive from the period before and after the Austro-Gothic rule between 490 and 535 AD, and the Slavic-Avar political alliance during the 7th and 8th centuries. The western half of today's Bosnia, stretching to the Verbas River, was, until the Ottoman conquests in the 15th century, a region of Croatian ecclesiastical and political processes, while it came under the political rule of medieval Bosnian rulers only during the 14th century. Porphyrogenitus' account very convincingly legitimates the situation in the 10th century. Here it is said, "From the Croats who came to Dalmatia, a part split off, and possessed themselves of Illyricum and Pannonia. They too had an independent prince, who used to maintain friendly contact, though through envoys only, with the Prince of Croatia." Bosnia was certainly located in this Illyricum, as one of Porphyrogenitus' Sclavinias, so named because the language, faith, legal order, and oral literature were Slavic. The mythological, ceremonial, and legal texts were delivered orally according to the Slavic tradition, from generation to generation.
By the 11th century, the Cyrillo-Methodian Slavicization of Christianity on the territory of today's Bosnia was conducted in its entirety, and extended to the most western parts of today's Republic of Croatia, to Istria. The scriptorial influence of Croatian Glagolitic on the tablet of Humats, in today's Western Herzegovina, from the 10th or 11th century, written in Cyrillic, is identifiable, while in the Bosnian diocese, which is first mentioned under that name in preserved sources on 8 January 1089, the Slavic language was used exclusively at that time. Alongside the Western Cyrillic, which will flourish in Bosnia and Huum and in the neighboring Croatian Dalmatian regions, until the beginning of the 19th century, the parallel use of the Glagolitic script will continue to the beginning of the 15th century. Changes in the political influences on Bosnia will also lead to a change in the suffragan position of the Bosnian diocese between the metropolitans in Split, Bar, and Dubrovnik. During the reign of Ban Quilin, from 1170 until 1204, the Bosnian diocese was a suffragan to the Archbishopric of Dubrovnik. In that period, the first reports of the appearance of heresy in Quilin's Bosnia were also recorded. With that, there began a new period in the political, ecclesiastical, and cultural history of medieval Bosnia. With the support of the Hungarian King Emmerich I, and with the consent of the Bosnian Ban Quilin, the papal legate John de Casamares arrived in Bosnia. On 8 April 1203, in Belino Polja, a locality near Zenica or Visoko, Casamares obliged the suspected Bosnian Christians, Kršćani, to a confession of orthodoxy. The text of this abjuration has been preserved in the Latin language. The Kršćani in Belino Polja accepted the abjuration without objection. After that, there reigned a lull, until the beginning of the second decade of the 13th century. At that time, inquisitorial, military, and missionary actions were organized for Bosnia, from Hungary, with the support of Rome. The result of these actions was the proclamation of the Bosnian Church as heretical in 1233, and the simultaneous establishment of a new diocese with a Latin ritual. The Dominicans were engaged as inquisitors, missionaries, and the first bishops at the time of the installation of the new Latin diocese, under the political patronage of Hungary. From that time, until the collapse of the Bosnian kingdom, we have two Christian churches, and two alphabets in medieval Bosnia: the Bosnian Church, with the Slavic language, suspected of heresy, and separated from Rome, and the newly established Latin diocese, with the Latin language and, from 1247, the position of a suffragan, in relation to the metropolitan in Hungarian Koloska. The seat of the newly established Latin diocese was transferred from Bosnia to Đakovo in the middle of the 13th century, while the historical sources, regarding the activity of the Dominicans, after that are quiet, all the way to the arrival of the Franciscans, who will push the Dominicans out of Bosnia in the second decade of the 14th century.
The Franciscan mission in Bosnia had a different political and social framework and achieved different results. The first recorded account on the appearance of a Franciscan monk in Bosnia originates from 1248, but the decisive step in setting up the Franciscan mission began with the arrival in Bosnia of the general of the Franciscan order, Gerard O'Donis, and the establishment of the Bosnian vicary in 1339 or 1340, established in agreement and cooperation with the Bosnian Ban Stephen Kotromanić II. The administrative seat of the Bosnian vicary was erected in central Bosnia, and due to its extension into two non-Bosnian regions, the vicary was divided and organized into custodies, custodii. According to the registry of Franciscan Bartolo from Pisa, composed between 1385 and 1390, in the second half of the 14th century, the Bosnian vicary had 7 custodies with 35 monasteries. According to the aforementioned registry, which did not encompass all the monasteries of the vicary of that time, the following 4 monasteries were located in central Bosnia: Visoko, Kraljeva Srpska, Olovo and Lashva. The 8th custody of St. Catherine in Apulia was added to the Bosnian vicary in 1393. Changes will occur in the demarcation between individual custodies, in other words, their separation, renaming, and annexation to the Bosnian vicary, but by the Ottoman conquest, their number will come to 8.
Historians who, for whatever reason, diminished the accounts of Franciscan missionary successes in medieval Bosnia, stressed the great spatiality of the Bosnian vicary, and emphasized that the reports of Franciscan successes related to the whole area of the vicary, so that they, therefore, concluded that their success in Bosnia itself was small. In contrast to such reasoning, there stands the fact that the number of Franciscan monasteries and residences on the territory of today's Bosnia and Herzegovina reached over 40 during the 15th century, which is not a small number. From a social and economic perspective, the Franciscan entry into medieval Bosnia is closely tied to the development of medieval urbanization in Bosnia during the 14th and 15th centuries, the opening of mines, and the emergence of trading and artisan settlements followed the erection of Franciscan monasteries and churches. The Franciscans were not only politically and socially anchored in medieval Bosnia, but they also cultivated 2 types of literacy in that period: the domestic literature written in Western Cyrillic, and the Latin, which was introduced in Bosnia before the Franciscans by the Dominicans. A similar condition existed at the court of the Bosnian kings. Alongside Cyrillic charters, on which the influence of the Serbian chancellery, after King Truco's occupation of Western Serbia, is recognizable, for the Bosnian kings established dynastic ties with Serbia, extended their rule over Serbian regions, and brought Serbian scribes to their court. There also existed in the chancellery of the Bosnian kings a Latin section, in which charters were copied in the Latin language. In its contacts with the Balkan hinterland, the Republic of Dubrovnik had a separate Slavic, sometimes called Serbian chancellery, and employed Western Cyrillic in its communication with Bosnia. One can easily differentiate between Dubrovnik's Slavic language type in communication with Bosnia before and after Truco's conquest of parts of Serbian lands. Croatian or Bosnian Western Shtokavian, in its pure form, had been afterwards frequently mixed with grammatically and lexically typical Serbian features.
There is no direct confirmation concerning the relation of the Franciscans toward the medieval sepulchral culture of tombstones and their Cyrillic epitaphs. The century-old research of these monuments, of which there are 100,000 examples throughout medieval Bosnia and Huam, as well as neighboring regions, brought to light that these tombstones were erected by members of all three Christian churches, Bosnian Church, Catholic Church and Orthodox Church, and that they do not reflect any separate heretical, bogomil theology or symbolism, but a general Christian medieval understanding of death, expressed in the vocabulary and ritual of the individual churches, blended with folk conceptions. In the second half of the 20th century, historical science freed itself from the attempt to bogomilize the Bosnian Church, observing that in question was not a sect driven to rebellion by its contemporary enemies, but an ecclesiastical institution with a classic Christian dogma and integrated in the Bosnian medieval feudal society. Good evidence for this statement is the testament of Radan Butković, high official of the Bosnian Church, dated in 1466, which is published in nearly all monographs on the Bosnian Church. Exposed to the pressures of the Roman Curia and Hungarian politics and the missionary activity of the Franciscans from the West, as well as the competitive behavior of the Serbian Orthodox Church from the East, the Bosnian Church fell into a centuries-old defensive position and, in face of the Ottoman conquest, disappeared from the historical stage.
Let's observe Bosnian Catholics in the Ottoman Islamic confessional paradigm. The Bosnian medieval, three-confessional palette contained the Bosnian Church in central Bosnia and the eastern parts of Huam, the Catholic Church in western Huam, western and central Bosnia, and the Serbian Orthodox Church on the eastern rim of today's Bosnia. During the long Ottoman period, it ceded a place to a new three-member, and even four-member confessional paradigm, if we add to this palette the Sephardic Jewish minority, which settled in Bosnia after its expulsion from Spain in 1492. As Ottoman auxiliary military units participating in the penetration toward the north and west, members of the Serbian Orthodox Church settled, in large numbers, not only in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in Slavonia, Lika, and Dalmatia, while the Serbian Orthodox Church installed itself in the new regions by erecting monasteries. At the same time, through the process of Oriental urbanization and Islamization, especially in the 16th century, Islam became deep-rooted in Bosnia as a new and ever stronger cultural and confessional reality. Reducing the intensive Islamization in Bosnia to a question of the so-called Bogomil past does not have a foothold in the historical sources, since Islamization is the result of complex political and social factors that lasted, intensely, for more than 300 years. According to contemporary Ottoman and Western sources, the Bosnian Catholics entered the Ottoman period as the numerically strongest confessional group in Bosnia. Their cultural profile was very similar to the one in Dubrovnik and the neighboring parts of Dalmatia: 2 alphabets, Latin and Western Cyrillic, and 2 literatures, in Latin and in the domestic linguistic idiom, which will, during the following centuries, continuously participate under different names: Slavic, Croatian, Bosnian, Illyrian, etc., in the development of Croatian literature and the modern Croatian linguistic standard. At the same time, under the pressure of numerous Austro-Turkish and Venetian Turkish wars, restrictive Islamic Ottoman regulations for non-Muslims, and Islamization, the number of Catholics and the number of Catholic churches and monasteries decreases. According to the Ottoman census in 1527, religious distribution in Bosnia was following: 57% Catholics, 37% Muslims, and 9% Orthodox. On the other hand, apostolic visitor of Albanian origin, Peter Masreki, found in 1624 the following population composition: 22% Catholics, 67% Muslims, and 11% Orthodox. Muslims remained a majority of 60 to 70%, until the mid-18th century, when they had been depopulated due to plague and constant warfare. Orthodox Vlachs and Serbs became a plural majority of 40 to 44%, and remained so until the census in 1971. Muslims have been the majority from the early to mid-1600s, following the first great wave of persecution and suppression of Catholics, who had been seen as the fifth column of Ottoman archenemies in Catholic Europe, especially Austria and Spain, while Venice was sort of Ottoman whore or frenemy, until the mid-18th century. There was no great pressure on the Orthodox, because their spiritual head was located in Istanbul, Constantinople, and was under Ottoman supervision. Bosnian Muslims suffered, later, disproportionately, from various contagions, because they had been mostly city dwellers, while Orthodox and Catholics lived in sparsely populated villages, and were frequently nomadic. Also, Muslims were recruited for Ottoman wars against Russia and Persia, so they lost, demographically, a significant number of the population. Uscox from Seine, who waged a long warfare in the 16th and the 17th centuries against the Ottoman Empire and, later, against Venice, were predominantly Croats, exclusively Catholics, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, something which contributed to the ill will and persecutions of Croatian Catholics between the Ottoman hammer and Venetian anvil. Also, it is rather telling that the surname Bošnjak, Bosniak, which means Bosnian or coming from Bosnia, is predominantly a Croatian one, while also present among Bosnian Muslims and Serbs. One could add the surname of ruling Bosnian dynasty Kotromanic, which was preserved in the form Kotromanovic, Kotroman, Kostroman, and some others, and which has been preserved almost exclusively among Catholics, another sign of ethnic historical connection between Bosnian Catholics and medieval Bosnian political cultural entity. In this book, you can find mentions of the Croatian name on Bosnian land throughout the centuries.
During the 16th century, the Catholics are pushed from first to second place by Muslims, while, during the late 17th, or more likely the 18th century, from second to third place by the Serbian Orthodox. The Great Turkish War, from 1683 until 1699, brought Bosnian Catholicism a numerical, social, and urban catastrophe. At that time, the number of Catholics in Bosnia and Western Herzegovina dropped to around 30,000, and in Eastern Herzegovina, the region of the Diocese of Trebinje, to just 2,200. Catholic merchants disappeared almost in their entirety, while their place was taken by Orthodox merchants during the 18th century. Out of the numerous Franciscan monasteries founded in the Middle Ages, only 3 in central Bosnia, Fojnica, Kraljeva Srpska, and Krševo, succeeded in surviving during the 18th century, and until the middle of the 19th century. owing to natural growth and, to a lesser extent, the immigration or return of Catholics, who moved to neighboring Dalmatia and Slavonia from Bosnia. During wartime, the numerical position of Catholics began to steadily improve and, at the beginning of the 19th century, reached the number of 100,000. Until the Austro-Hungarian occupation in 1878, the number doubled, so that the Austro-Hungarian census conducted in 1879 registered 209,391 Catholics, or 18.08% out of the total population of Bosnia. The political and cultural history of confessions in Bosnia in the Ottoman period unfolded according to different political, cultural, and social patterns. The Muslims, or the Islamicized part of the population, sooner or later, completely integrated into the Ottoman Islamic system and, in close correlation with this process, more rapidly abandoned and forgot the medieval Bosnian Christian political and cultural traditions. The quickest political breach occurred in regard to the institution of the medieval Bosnian kingdom. The Ottomans conquered Bosnia and did not adopt one of its political institutions into its system, so that talk of an alleged continuity between the medieval Bosnian kingdom and the Ottoman Bosnian Eyalet does not have a historical or legal political basis.
In the cultural field, the Islamicized part of the population was quickest to dispense with the culture of the tombstones. Amongst the first Islamic tombstones from the 1st century of Ottoman rule in Bosnia, until the middle of the 16th century, archaeologists have discovered, alongside 20 Islamic tombstones of non-Bosnian origin, with epitaphs in the Arabic language, 29 syncretic tombstones, which according to their form, alphabet, and language, stand in direct connection with medieval tombstones. By the middle of the 16th century, this sepulchral culture amongst the Bosnian Muslims was extinguished. The Muslims had already begun the transcription of Slavic or Bosnian texts in the Arabic alphabet by the end of the 15th century, but they continued to employ the Western Cyrillic. For how long? Interestingly enough, the first written song of the Alhamiado literature bears the name of Hrvat Turkisi, or Croatian song, in 1589. The customary reference to the Cyrillic letters of the commanders of Ottoman frontier stations, sent to neighbors under Venetian and Austrian rule, in the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, is uncertain, because the Ottoman commanders in these cases also employed their Christian subjects as scribes. The question remains whether they always used them. Other examples of Cyrillic literacy amongst Muslims have not been preserved, or have not been discovered, while the Muslims of Bosnia fought for the further use of the Arabic, and not Cyrillic script, in the Bosnian Provincial Parliament in 1911. Last but not least, one should mention that the historical writing of Bosnian Muslims began to be interested in medieval Bosnia only after the Austro-Hungarian occupation. Flourishing of Bosnian Muslim literature in Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman Turkish should be mentioned as an indicator of strong cultural assimilation of Slavic Bosnian with the Ottoman Empire.
The influx of members of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Bosnia began before the Ottoman conquest of the Bosnian Kingdom and flowed continuously until the 19th century. Statistics note the relative numerical predominance of the Serbs in Bosnia over the Bosnian Muslims or Bosniaks from the 18th century to the 1971 census. In today's Bosnia, the Muslims or Bosniaks have a relative numerical majority, around 44%. The cultural pattern of the members of the Serbian Orthodox Church in Bosnia was brought from Serbia and is not identical with the cultural pattern of the Bosnian Catholics or the extinguished Bosnian Church. On their paths toward the north and west, the Serbian Church brought the political traditions of exclusively Serbian medieval rulers and cultivated the ecclesiastical Old Slavic literacy, distant from the popular language. Nevertheless, the contacts with the cultural patterns found in Bosnia also left their traces on the practice of the Serbian Orthodox Church and its members. Thus, the Serbian Orthodox Church used a few liturgical codices of the extinguished Bosnian Church, furnishing them with their own glosses, and changed them to suit linguistically and theologically orthodox Serbian functions, while the culture of the tombstones was developed among the Orthodox Vlachs in eastern Hercegovina, intensively in the 15th and 16th centuries, and, sporadically in the 18th century. The examples of Western Cyrillic on Orthodox tombstones, or in the letters of Orthodox clergy sent to Western recipients, place us before the same problem as in the case of the Bosnian Muslims, namely, as it is not clear who were the scribes of such texts. They were probably Catholics, as stonecutters of epitaphs, or scribes of letters, which were written in the climate of political collaboration between Western interested parties and Balkan Christians under Ottoman rule.
In contrast to the Serbian Orthodox Church and its members in Bosnia, who did not cultivate any political or cultural tradition of medieval Bosnia, and the Bosnian Muslims who quickly abandoned reminiscences of medieval Bosnia, the Bosnian Catholics cultivated, within the framework and possibilities of the Bosnian Franciscan province, Bosnian medieval political and cultural traditions, throughout the entire Ottoman period. They maintained the culture of the tombstones in artistically reduced forms, and the medieval political traditions, through the further use of medieval political terminology, and preserving the memory of medieval Bosnian rulers until the modern national projects, and after. In the same period, through their bilingual literacy, Western Cyrillic or scriptand Latin, which had already emerged in the Middle Ages, the Catholics intensified their cultural ties with Croats in Dalmatia, Dubrovnik, and Slavonia. In other words, they actively participated in the development of Croatian linguistic and literary culture, according to Western cultural patterns, from the 16th century onward. They were indirectly aided in this direction by the political changes brought about by the Ottoman conquests. For, after the conquest of Bosnia, the Ottoman conquests stretched to the neighboring northern and western Croatian regions. In 1463, the year of the conquest of the Bosnian kingdom, the Bosnian Franciscans found a modus vivendi and legitimation for their spiritual activity in the Ottoman Empire through the charter of the Sultan Mehmed II el-Fatih. This enabled them to install in the occupied regions their province Bosna Srebrena, literally, Silver Bosnia or Bosna Argentina, so named after the administrative center in Srebrenica during the 16th century. The province was installed in the region, where the former ecclesiastical organization was almost destroyed, in order to once again organize spiritual activity amongst the Catholic population. In return, not only did the Catholics of Bosnia and Herzegovina enter the ranks of Bosna Srebrena, but so too did their counterparts of Dalmatia, Lika, Slavonia, and the Danube Basin, and thus, they became Bosnian Franciscans.
Since the architectural activity of non-Islamic communities was essentially restricted by strict Islamic regulations, there was no development of Renaissance and Baroque architecture in the regions of Bosna Srebrena, as in Dubrovnik, and other Dalmatian communes, but the Bosnian Franciscans intensified the bilingual literature with two alphabets. The examples of their literacy in the Latin language were preserved in continuity from the 14th to the 19th century. These are expert texts from philosophy, theology, law, history and medicine, and individuals tried their hand at poetry in the Latin language. Far more important for the Croatian cultural profile of the Bosnian Catholics is the literature of Bosna Srebrena, written in Western Cyrillic. In spite of various appellations during the centuries, the lingua patria and Cyrillic script of the Bosnian Franciscans carries in itself the developmental dynamic of the Croatian language. In it, the Franciscans shaped their pious literary texts. The lingua patria of the Bosnian Franciscans has two sources: the living Western Shtokavian oral speech vernacular, which was mutually intelligible with Serbian Eastern Shtokavian, did not see confessional boundaries as a communication hurdle, and other source, around literary models originating in the 15th and 16th centuries from Croatian cultural areas in both Croatian vernacular literacy and Western Latin language literacy.
One should add that Franciscan writing had been marginalized from the late 1800s to the breakup of Yugoslavia, mainly due to the ideology of Serbocroatism. No wonder that fundamental texts, like philological monographs, stylistic studies, and linguistically analyzed reprints on the Bosnian Franciscan literature, appeared only in the 21st century. The beginnings of Franciscan religious literature are usually tied with the reform in the Catholic Church after the Council of Trent, in the middle of the 16th century, and with the name of Franciscan Matija Divković as its head and the most widely read writer of that literature. However, there is reason to link the beginnings of this literature with the so-called Šibenic prayer from the 14th century. Paleographic and linguistic analyses of the Šibenic prayer, the oldest preserved example of Croatian medieval religious lyric poetry, suggests an origin from a Franciscan milieu and Western Cyrillic literacy, which flourished in Bosnia, Huum, and littoral Croatia. From Divković onward, the authors of Franciscan religious literature are no longer anonymous, nor did they originate only from Bosnia, but also from the Croatian regions, over which the Franciscan province of Bosna Srebrena extended. They built their literature on common bookish models and mutual textual influences, in which Muslim and Serbian Orthodox literacy, which developed according to different political and cultural models and sources, was left to the side. The Franciscan Matija Divković is the formal founder of Bosnian Franciscan vernacular literature written in Croatian language. His works influenced the Franciscan literature in the 17th and 18th century by the choice of themes of moral and didactic texts, and, especially by the inheritance of stylistic and language features. Many other later Franciscan writers, who wrote in Bosnia and Herzegovina, followed the track of Divković in shaping the literary language. His influence was extended over other religious writers on the Croatian soil, in all parts of Bosna, Argentina, for example the father of Croatian philology Jesuit Bartol Karšić, who is the author of the first complete Bible translation into Croatian, in the language of Dubrovnik variety from 1622 to 1633. His Bible is very important, among other things, because it shows that Karšić follows some specific language and stylistic features of older Croatian translators of religious literature and Bible texts. Therefore, the juxtaposition of Divković's and Karšić's elements of Bible translation parts shows cultural and linguistic unity in religious phraseology and terminology in the two exemplary works of liturgical literature that paved the way for modern standard Croatian language without language contact with Serbian and Bosnian Muslim Slavic written corpora.
In that way, a Croatian Korni language was formed, which created a network of regional dialects and culturally connected the Catholic populace between the Adriatic Sea and Danube Basin, until the Illyrian movement in the 1830s and 1840s, at which time there appeared new political and cultural trends in the South Slavic areas. This literature defined the separate cultural identity of the Catholics, distinct from the identity of the Orthodox and Muslims, and merged it through the medium of language and literature into a common Croatian cultural identity. The Catholic populace wholeheartedly accepted and recognized this literature as its own. Divković's Christian doctrine underwent over 25 editions, while believers knew his texts by heart, so that they would protest when an individual preacher would slightly deviate from Divković's version. the Croatian Catholic confessional culture, controlled and actively supported by the Church as a cultural institution, imbued all spheres of life of the populace, popular literature and customs, family life, the manner of nourishment, ethical life, residential spaces, calendar, and, of course, traditional clothing.
The Great Turkish War, in the last decades of the 17th century, ended with the ousting of the Ottomans from Slavonia, the Danube Basin, Lika and the continental part of Dalmatia. New Franciscan provinces are established in the former Ottoman regions, under Venetian and Habsburg rule, while Bosna-Srebrena retreats, within the borders of Bosnia, which further remains an Ottoman province, and struggles for the survival of its three monasteries in central Bosnia, Kraljeva Sučica, Vojnica, and Kreševo. Nevertheless, in spite of the firm political and sanitary borders between the Ottoman Empire and its Christian neighbors, the Croatian cultural model, in other words, the achieved cultural community of Bosnian Catholics with Croatian Catholics outside of Bosnia, does not weaken, but rather is further developed. In the 18th century, alongside the further cultivation of religious literature, the Bosnian Franciscans devoted themselves to the writing of chronicles. The Franciscans Nikola Lashvanin, Bono Benić, and Marion Bogdanović write these chronicles, exceptionally important for the history of the society, language, literature and culture, not only of the Bosnian Croats, but, also, their neighbors the Bosnian Muslims, and Orthodox Serbs, either in the spoken language of their milieu and their time, or, in Latin and Italian, and as a product, not only of their education, but also their political caution in unsecure Bosnia and Herzegovina. These Franciscans are joined by Philip Lastrich, as the first historian of Bosnia in the modern sense of the word, because he wrote his survey of the antiquities of the Bosnian province, published 1776 in Ancona. It was not written as a chronicle, but as a methodical work in Latin, and partly in Italian, in order to defend the ecclesiastical political individuality and precedence of his province before the new established provinces that emerged after the division of Bosna-Srebrena during the 18th century. It is significant that in his discussion, Lastrich dedicated 2 chapters to the medieval Bosnian kingdom, in order to additionally strengthen his defense of Bosna-Srebrena. In this type of literacy, the Franciscan chroniclers and the historian Lastrich had recourse to Western models, above all Croatian literacy, as was established by another Franciscan, Ignatius Gavran, who was born in 1914, at the time of the preparation of the critical editions of Franciscan Chronicles, and the Bosnian Antiquities of Lastrich in the 1970s, but not to models from the Muslim Bosniak or Serbian circles, amongst other reasons, because such texts emerged in these circles somewhat later.
What can we say about Bosnian Croats and modern national movements? In many publicist texts, particularly Bosniak, it can be read that Croatdom and Serbdom were introduced into Bosnia only in the 19th century by the national and nationalist propaganda from neighboring Croatia and Serbia. However, we have shown that such assertions are incorrect. It is more likely to state that the neighboring national movements of Croats and Serbs provided a new momentum and a new secularist tone to the already existing Croatian Catholic and Serbian Orthodox cultural structures. This process endeavored to stop the Ottoman reformist politics of the 19th century, as well as the Austro-Hungarian modernizing policies which succeeded the Ottoman, and which prohibited the Croatian and Serbian names in Bosnia, and introduced Bosniakness as the national appellation for all the inhabitants of Bosnia, but which in the final analysis did not succeed. Until the Austro-Hungarian occupation, the cultural and political leadership of the Bosnian Croats remained in the hands of the Franciscans. Their schooling in Slavonia and Hungary, under Austrian rule, from the end of the 18th century, awoke an interest for national, cultural and political movements amongst individuals. These movements, which sought not only cultural and political emancipation from foreign rule, the Ottoman and Habsburg empires, but also to politically overcome confessionalism and to construct a modern secular culture, attracted the participation of a considerable part of the Croatian clergy, particularly the lower clergy. It included the Franciscan Illyrians in Bosnia, such as Martin Nedić, Gerga Martić, Ivan Franjo Jukić, and others. Individual Franciscans, such as Martić and Jukić, attempted to cooperate with the Serbian national movement by publishing their texts in Serbian journals, the editors of which Serbianized their texts. This was, nevertheless, just one episode. In the 1860s, Martić recognized the greater Serbian character of Serbian propaganda in Bosnia, and, ahead of the Congress of Berlin in 1878, accepts the Austro-Hungarian, and not Serbian and Montenegrin occupation of Bosnia, which some Croatian Yugoslavists and other representatives of the Croatian cultural and political public resented due to their ignorance, more or less, of the real state of affairs in Bosnia, or their own opportunism. Until the Austro-Hungarian occupation of Bosnia, the cultural and political activity of the Bosnian Franciscans unfolded, within the framework of Illyrianism and Yugoslavism, in the manner of a Croatian federalist and not Serbian unitarist interpretation of these national movements and ideologies.
Naturally, the opening of the Franciscans towards secular political and cultural movements was reflected in their mutual relations, especially in the so-called Berešich affair in the 1830s and 1840s. This affair caused a deep division amongst the Bosnian Franciscans and resulted in the administrative detachment of Hercegovina from Bosna Srebrena in 1846, and the establishment of a separate apostolic vicariate for Herzegovina. The mutually bitter polemics led the apostolic vicar Rafo Berešich and his supporters, who mainly studied in Italy and were imbued with the contemporary ecclesiastical conservatism, to reproach their opponents, educated in Slavonia and Hungary, for being imbued with an anti-Roman secularist spirit, that they had absorbed revolutionary ideas, and that, with the help of Ludovic Guy, they were intending to raise a rebellion and establish the Illyrian kingdom. With the Austro-Hungarian occupation in 1878, there begins a new period for both Bosnian Franciscans and for the Bosnian Croats as a whole. From a legal perspective, Christians were granted equality with Muslims. But the situation in a cultural and political sense, for all three Bosnian confessions, Muslims, Catholics and Orthodox, became more complex. Namely, the migration of 100,000 qualified workers, technicians, civil servants, and teachers, from the Habsburg monarchy to Bosnia, did not only bring cultural and technical modernization, but also competition, which led to dissatisfaction, particularly amongst the Bosnian Muslims. With the migration of new muscle from the monarchy, especially after the disbandment of the military frontier in Croatia, in 1881, the Bosnian Croats were numerically strengthened, so that their percentage rose from 18.08% to 22.81% from 1879 to 1910, but there also developed unfavorable competition between the autochthonous and newly settled Croats, particularly after the introduction of an established Catholic ecclesiastical hierarchy in 1881, which decided to gradually displace the Franciscans from the church and public life. This introduced a conflict between the secular clergy and the Franciscans that has not been resolved to the present day.
What can we say about Bosnian Croats and the ideologies of the 20th century? After the Austro-Hungarian occupation in 1878, the cultural and political development of the Bosnian Croats flows in a reinforced communication with the cultural and political processes in Dalmatia, Croatia, and Slavonia, in spite of the efforts of Benjamin von Calais, Austro-Hungarian Minister of Finances in charge for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and his associates, to isolate Bosnia from the national movements of Serbs and Croats. With the growth of Greater Serbianism in the 1880s, and under the influence of Croatian settlers, the Franciscans converted from Yugoslavism to the Greater Croatian ideology, according to which Bosnia is an exclusively Croatian territory. On the other hand, a significant number of Franciscans, nevertheless, showed an interest in political cooperation with other confessional nationalities in Bosnia, and thus, retained some openness toward Yugoslavism. At the turn of the 20th century, the Franciscans found political allies in the first generation of Croatian higher education graduates from Bosnia, who completed their education at European universities and returned to their homeland. Together with their compatriots from Dalmatia, Croatia, and Slavonia, they brought liberal understandings on culture and politics from the universities at which they studied. This will introduce a new dynamic in the organization of cultural and political life in Bosnia, and provoke ideological and political divisions amongst the Bosnian Croats. In the first decade of the 20th century, at the time when the modern political life of the Bosnian Croats begins, with the formation of cultural and social organizations and then political parties, the ideological political spectrum included, on one side, the Archbishop of Sarajevo Josip Stadler, and his supporters with a clerical program for the 20th century and an uncompromising Greater Croatdom, and, on the other side, the Croatian liberal secular intelligentsia, more open to political and ideological compromises, and supported by the Franciscans, not because of liberalism, but due to their conflict with Archbishop Stadler. Stadler strove to displace both the Franciscans and liberals from public life, but he was unsuccessful, especially when it was a question of political parties. Croatian nationalist liberals in Bosnia also, following the ideology of Ante Starčević, who extolled Bosnian Muslims as genetically the purest Croats, openly propagated, with great success among newly enlightened Bosnian Muslim Europeanizing intelligentsia, a sort of supraconfessional Croatian unity of Catholics and Muslims, which would make thus defined Croats a stable majority in Bosnia.
On the one side, the Bosnian Croats entered the First World War with this ideological political paradigm, the Starčević-type liberals who considered all Catholics and Muslims to be ethnic Croats. On the second side, Franciscans with a readiness for political compromises, and a soft Greater Croatian conception of Bosnia, and on the third, Stadler and his supporters, with a rigid clericalism and Croatdom. After the military defeat of the Habsburg monarchy, and the resuscitation of political activities in the spring of 1917, Stadler's clericalism and rigid Croatdom in Bosnia caves in. Not only do the liberal intelligentsia and Franciscans in Bosnia, and then in Herzegovina, declare themselves in favor of Yugoslavism, but so too do a part of Stadler's supporters. Archbishop Stadler, as the last Mohican of clerical Greater Croatdom, signs a circular of the Catholic Episcopate from 29 November 1918, which welcomed the establishment of the Yugoslav state, under Serbian aegis, and dies on 8 December 1918.
In the Kingdom of Yugoslavia, which lasted from 1918 until 1941, Bosnia lost the status it had as a corpus separatum, or to use a modern term, a third entity or condominium of the dualist Austro-Hungarian monarchy. The legal continuity with the former state of affairs was abolished, and from 1929, Bosnia was administratively blended with neighboring non-Bosnian territories. The political life in the first Yugoslavia unfolded above all in the struggles between the unitarists and federalists, who also did not intercede on behalf of the separate status of Bosnia. The unitarist concept of state was implemented as a political practice until 1939. From the Croatian-Serbian Agreement of the 26th of August 1939 until the collapse of the First Yugoslavia in 1941, the concept of the three-member federation, founded on the Serbs, Croats and Slovenes as nations on defined territories, the Croatian Banovina, the Drava Banovina or Slovenia, and the so-called Serbian lands, was briefly implemented. Bosnia was divided between Serbs and Croats, while the Bosnian Muslims remained unrecognized as a separate ethnic group. This was the result of a few confluent elements, one of them being the death of Bosnian leader Mehmed Spaho, who led the dominant Bosnian Muslim political party, Yugoslav Muslim Organization, which frequently switched sides during 2 decades in effort to preserve Muslim autonomy and class positions of the remnants of Bosnian Muslim Ottoman-derived aristocracy. The political life of the Bosnian Croats in the first Yugoslavia flowed in an intensive communication with Croats in Dalmatia and Slavonia, chiefly through the Croatian Peasant Party as the dominant Croatian political organization. The main bearer of cultural development was the Croatian Cultural Society Napredak, which was founded in Sarajevo in 1904 and became the Society of All Bosnian and Hercegovinian Croats in 1907. In the first Yugoslavia, Napredak extended its educational and social activities amongst Croats outside of Bosnia, and represented the main force in the cultural life of the Croats in the same way that the Croatian Peasant Party was the main force in political life.
After the fall of the first Yugoslavia, and the establishment of the Croatian state that lasted from 1941 till 1945, in which Bosnia found itself as a component part, the leading role in the creation of the political and cultural reality during the Second World War, fell into the hands of Serb royalist Chetniks, Croat Ustasha and also communist organizations. The communists emerged as the victors out of this bloody war, which left hundreds of thousands of victims and deep traumas. They succeeded in displacing the former civic culture, political parties, and cultural associations, and, also, establishing the Second Yugoslavia, that lasted until 1991, as a communist one-party federal state, in which Bosnia received the status of one of the 6 federal republics. Contemporary historiography is only at its beginnings in its efforts to reconstruct a more or less objective picture of this very complex period, because both sides, anti-communist or fascist, and communist, committed crimes which are very difficult to face openly. The communists, and their descendants, have great difficulty recognizing that the communists committed mass crimes against their enemies and ideological opponents, during, and immediately after the final military operations. They probably committed more crimes, numerically speaking, than the fascists or anti-communists against members of the Croatian nation, albeit with different motives and consequences. For that reason, the undertaking of measures that intend not to juxtapose Bleiburg and marches of death, as a metaphor of communist crimes, and Jasenovac, as a metaphor of Ustasha crimes, can only be counterproductive for historical science. It is true, to be sure, that Jasenovac and Bleiburg are not the same, as Ivo Goldstein and Slavko Goldstein point out, but their comparison is unavoidable if historical memory is to obtain its actual context and anchorage in truth, in place of tempting and untruthful slogans, according to which only the fascists or anti-communists fought, on the side of evil, while their opponents, the communists, exclusively on the side of good. Power in Yugoslavia after 1945 was distributed according to the aforementioned mainstream perception of victims on the partisan side, while victims on the anti-communist side were neglected. Additionally, participation in the war on the partisan side was also a factor that influenced the distribution of power in Yugoslavia. The first anti-fascist or communist partisan detachment, composed of Croats, is associated with June 22, 1941, in Sisak, Croatia. This date marks Germany's attack on the Soviet Union. The organizers of the uprising in 1941, and among the Serbian population in the beginning, a good, and surprisingly large part, were Croats in all parts of Croatia and Bosnia. Josip Broz Tito gave, in mid-1944, speaking about the ethnic composition of his army, data on 44% Serbs, 30% Croats, etc. Serbs made up about 41% of the population in the area of Yugoslavia, and in the partisan units 44%, while Croats with about 23% of the population, 30%. Of 3 army generals with some general rank obtained during the war until 1945, all 3 were national Croats. There were the most Croats in all units that led serious military offensive operations in 1944 until 1945, Batina, Mostar, Knin, Rijeka, Trieste, except in the cases of Belgrade and Sarajevo. In the fateful negotiations on the future of Yugoslavia after the war, the negotiators from the partisan side were Croats Josip Broz and Vladimir Bakaric, and from the royalist Ivan Šabašić, Ban of Croatia. But Croats from Bosnia and especially Hercegovina did not fight on the communist side in significant numbers, and were overrepresented in the Axis units, so, after the end of war, they suffered disproportionately. Bosnian Croats were especially stigmatized as a reactionary, potentially fascist people, and were subjected to repression of all sorts, spanning from physical liquidation, arrests of Catholic clergy, to planned economic impoverishment of Croatian areas in Bosnia that forced local Croats to emigrate and to the process of the cultural decroatization. All this was possible only because of the totalitarian nature of communist regime, which softened somewhat during the 1970s, but essentially remained the same until the collapse in 1991. On November 25, 1943, in Bosnia, the top political organization of the partisans, Territorial Anti-Fascist Council of People's Liberation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, declared that Bosnia and Herzegovina belonged to the Croatians, the Muslims, and the Serbians, emphasizing its multinational composition rather than being one nation and one state, like Croatia and Serbia. It is interesting to note that out of the 93 generals in the independent state of Croatia, 13 were Orthodox, including Đuro Grujić, who held the highest military rank. Additionally, some Četniks were also enlisted in the service of the independent state of Croatia. Services of the independent state of Croatia saved the lives of American pilots in one occasion, and, on the other occasion, Četniks saved other group of American pilots. All of these facts contribute to a complex and difficult to understand picture, as opposed to the simplified mainstream narrative during communist Yugoslavia. Croats were, during the Second World War, the nation that was, among Yugoslav peoples, more under arms, on both sides, in comparison with the rest, and, somewhat more so on the side of the Croatian state, although that changed over time. With the communist move from 1944, which equalized in the moral and political sense Croatian home guards and Četniks, with an invitation to join the partisans, while they still can, and excluded the Ustašas and condemned them to extermination, a monstrous historical act was committed and resulted in mass atrocities, since Četniks, as the dirtiest military organization on the ground of the past, and the future Yugoslavia, with a history of genocide, since the period before the First World War, and mass crimes against Albanians, Muslims, Macedonians, Croats, and in the tragedy of the Second World War, with the similar genocidal intentions as the Ustaša, were in fact mostly amnestied only because of Yugoslav orientation, even in the Greater Serbian cutthroat garb. political regime and military forces of the independent state of Croatia were consistently against the renewal of Yugoslavia, which was based on the negative experience from the first Yugoslavia. Regarding culture in partisans, Croats created the only culture worth mentioning. The most prominent artists in the partisans were Croats, or Croatian Serbs, identified with Croatian culture.
In short, bearing in mind the aforementioned observations on the crimes that were built into the foundations not only of the Croatia during the Second World War, but also Tito's Yugoslavia, for at the time of establishing their rule, the communists squared accounts with their enemies and ideological opponents in a bloody and brutal manner and on a mass scale. Only after this had occurred did their state employ milder forms of oppression and never developed into a democratic state. In the following content, we will give some notations focusing on the political and cultural conditions of the Bosnian and Herzegovinian Croats in the Communist Socialist Republic of Bosnia and Hercegovina, and after the collapse of Yugoslavia, in so-called Dayton, Bosnia and Hercegovina. 3 facts influenced, in various ways, the cultural development of the ethnic groups in Bosnia, Muslims or today's Bosniaks, Croats and Serbs, under communist rule. First, the status of Bosnia as a federal republic. Second, Tito and Stalin breakup in 1948, and the political link-up with the so-called Third World, to which the majority of Islamic countries belonged. Third, the linguistic policy of Serbo-Croatism, with its explicit predominance of the Serbian language over the Croatian. These 3 facts taken together influenced the favorable development of the Bosnian Muslims into a modern nation at the end of the 20th century, namely, the republican status of Bosnia removed the potential Croatian and real Serbian pressure to which the Muslims had been exposed to in the first Yugoslavia. Tito's political association with the Islamic world opened the possibility of the cultivation of the Islamic cultural identity, and the Serbo-Croatism that was consistently implemented was wholeheartedly accepted by the Islamic religious press. Therefore, it is not surprising that the Bosniaks or Muslims in today's Bosnia are constructing their modern linguistic standard on a Serbo-Croatian basis, while one can observe a reinforced Serbianization among the Bosnian Serbs and a return to Croatian linguistic traditions among the Croats. Though the Croatian-Serbian Agreement from 1939 brought the Greater Serbian Project into question and was nominally kept at bay in the Second Yugoslavia, a latent Serbianization of the linguistic culture in the educational system and public life was nevertheless implemented. The cultural contacts between Bosnian and Herzegovinian Croats with the Socialist Republic of Croatia were admittedly not rendered impossible, but they were made ever more difficult. The Croatist linguistic policies of the Croatian state during the Second World War was used as an excuse to declare all specifically Croatian language traits as an Ustaša language, and therefore their use was prevented. The practical consequence of such a situation was that the language of the Bosnian Croats, who were schooled in Bosnia and published their texts in Sarajevo and other Bosnian towns, was considerably Serbianized. Only the organizations of the Catholic Church successfully resisted Serbianization in their professional work and press and tacitly followed the linguistic processes in the Republic of Croatia. The most important Croatian linguists and lexicographers with roots in Bosnia, Dalibor Brozovic and Tomislav Ladan, could not influence the official language policy in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
Dissolution, war and political aims. Without going into strategic and military details, we will just sketch the dominant positions of three Bosnian peoples, as articulated through their elites, political, cultural, military, economic, etc. For Serbs, the entire Bosnia was Serbian land, and the goal was to occupy it all. What is crucial is this: since Slobodan Milosevic's plan, and virtually the plan of the entire Serbian elite, was not limited to Bosnia, it aimed primarily at amputation of the approximately 70% of Croatia, following the Yugoslav People's Maneuvers Line from 1986 and, striking at 5 directions, to slice the Croatian territory in a few indefensible pockets, leaving Zagreb, Rijeka and Istria parts as some kind of reliquiarum, and probably forcing Croatian leadership to capitulate completely, having achieved the goal of conquering the entire Croatia and Bosnia. These two countries were, militarily, one war occupation zone. But Serbian Yugoslav plans were thwarted in all directions: first, Varaždin, Pakrac, Banja Luka; second, Šid, Vukovar and Vinkovci; third, Zadar, Šibenik, Kanin, Travar; fourth, Split and Mostar; and fifth, Dubrovnik, Trebinje, and Montenegro. So, they were holding approximately 25% of Croatia's territory at the end of 1991. The dominant goal was all Serbs in one Serbian state, with policy toward Croats oscillating from vandalism and ethnic pressures to outright ethnic cleansing and genocide. Their idea was to destroy Croatian nationhood wherever possible, to occupy 3 million out of 4.5 million Croats, and to get rid of the most by a combination of killing, cleansing, forced assimilation, encouraging Croatian regional identities as non-Croat, for instance, Croatian Bojevci, and pressure to emigrate. As regards Bosnian Muslims, it is not clear what the final goal was, so there was a difference between strategy and tactics. Judging from the actions of Serbian elite, they first tried to split so-called natural alliance between Croats and Muslims, by offering Bosnian Muslim politicians, like Adil Zulfikar Pasic, a historical compromise between Serbs and Muslims, which would result in incorporation of almost the entire Bosnia, with possible exception of tiny Croatian majority parts, into extended Serbia, and, theoretically guaranteeing Muslims some kind of autonomous existence, without war, if they distance themselves from Croatia. But, since the whole Serbian elite was radically against everything Catholic and Muslim, as something utterly alien and non-Serbian, various conspiracy theories including the Vatican, Pan-Islamism, Masons, European West etc., it is evident, judging both from Serbian mass media, torrent of pan-Serbian publications, and historical books and pamphlets, that coexistence with Muslims was impossible in the long run. In a nutshell, with just a few dissenting voices, the dominant Serbian discourse was that Catholic Croats and Bosniak Muslims were Serbian historical civilizational enemies, and there was no room for clearly articulated Croatian and Bosniak or Muslim identity in a Serbian nation-state. Bosnian Muslims, later Bosniaks, attitudes have been more complex and sometimes contradictory. From the current vantage point, it seems they had been generally satisfied with their position in Yugoslavia, and wanted this country to continue to exist, as it had been during Tito's rule. They wanted national crystallization, but not completely. They were mostly content with the status of a recognized people, without fully completed cultural, historical, national individuality. Perhaps this has something to do with the nature of Islamic civilization, which puts religion first and isn't too conducive to European-style national emancipation. Although they wanted to stay in Yugoslavia, it was not Yugoslavia according to Serbian ideas, as articulated by Milosevic and Serbian elites. Without Slovenia and Croatia, they knew it would be, essentially, an extended Serbia. Also, being unarmed, they were terrified by images of destruction and war in Croatia in 1991, so they wanted to avoid Yugoslav army aggression and mass killings. Yugoslav army had, after withdrawal from Slovenia, transferred and amassed military machinery to Bosnia, tanks, planes, armored cars, howitzers, helicopters, ammunition, rocket launchers, rifles, machine guns. Also, the Yugoslav officer corps until 1990 was Serbianized, 69.7% were Serbs and Montenegrins, and after 1990, almost completely Serbianized, Serbs and Montenegrins constituting over 98% of military personnel. With first democratic elections, Bosnian Muslims gave the majority of their votes to Party of Democratic Action, a party with Islamist leadership, headed by ex-political convict Alija Izetbegović. Although this Muslim party had, like all parties, a few fractions, the chief aims were to avoid Yugoslav attack on Bosnian Muslims, and to retain Bosnia as a unitary republic, rejecting all proposals for internal reconstruction along national, ethnic lines, as well as to work on re-Islamization of a rather secular Muslims. Izetbegovic's famous statement, "This is not our war," reflected the majority Bosnian Muslim position on the Yugoslav, Serbian and Montenegrin war of aggression in Croatia. It was not just because of fear of the Serbianized Yugoslav army military might, it also showed genuine and prevalent Bosnian Muslims' attitude that it was a war between Serbs and Croats. Hence, Muslims had no stake in the game, but, also, the dominant Muslim theory of false equivalence, with regard to two sides in the conflict, avoiding at all costs to name Serbian Yugoslav army side as the aggressor. This policy enraged not only Croatia, but even more Croats in Bosnia, who had been fighting in the defense of Croatia. For instance, during the siege of Vukovar, approximately 60 to 70% of Croatian units' manpower consisted of Croats from Bosnia. Also, Muslim leadership turned a blind eye on the Yugoslav army destruction of Croatian village Ravno in Hercegovina, which could be considered the real beginning of war in Bosnia, but Bosnian Muslims were looking the other way, and, suspiciously, had failed to notice it, because there were no Muslims attacked. Summarily, it could be said that the dominant Bosnian Muslim policy was dictated by fear of Yugoslav army military aggression. They saw what was happening in Croatia, that they wanted to preserve Bosnia as a state, that they opposed any internal reconfiguration of Bosnia and Herzegovina, along national lines, that they wanted re-Islamization of their own people, and had put all their trust in the international community, hoping it would prevent carnage in Bosnia. Evidently, they didn't learn anything from the war in Croatia. Also, judging from works and deeds of Alija Izetbegović, and some of his associates, it seems they hoped they would numerically prevail over Croats and Serbs, and thus dictate the lives of these two peoples by sheer majorization, becoming a clear majority from the relative 40 to 45%. This was combined with idealization of the Ottoman rule. The majority of inner leadership of Izetbegovic's party consisted of descendants of Muslim landed gentry, beys, begovi, so that historical and proto-national Ottoman emotional and cultural reflexes were naturally present among both Bosnian Muslim leadership and population.
The Bosnian Croat policy was articulated through continual discourse with Croatia's leadership and its party, Croatian Democratic Community, led by former Tito's general and dissident Franjo Tudjman. The context in which Tudjman's Bosnian policy took shape was as follows, with the clearly defined desire of the Serbian population of Bosnia and Herzegovina to join Serbia and Yugoslavia, as well as the Muslim, Bosniak insistence on the concept of a unitary Bosnia, which would be an ideal basis for ethnic territorial majorization. Muslims, who made up 30.73% of the population in 1948, according to the 1991 census, were 43.67% of the total population. In that period, Croats fell from 23.94% to 17.32%, and Serbs from 44.29% to 31.37%. Tudjman profiled the policy towards Bosnia and Herzegovina as a series of options. One option, in the case of the disintegration of Bosnia, he intended to annex the regions with a Croat majority, with possible separation in parts, Herzegovina, Central Bosnia, and Bosnian Posavina. Other option, in the case of the survival of Bosnia, the goal was a maximally decentralized Bosnia as a state, with insistence on the possibility of expanded cooperation of Croats with Croatia, as well as territorial sovereignty in certain parts, as well as constituent status and sovereignty in the recomposed Bosnia, not only on paper, but also in the elements that make up life: army, police, education, economy, cultural institutions. Tudjman, like the vast majority of Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina, who put their trust in the Croatian Democratic Party of Bosnia and Herzegovina, chose the following option: the headquarters and safe strongholds for the defense, preservation and growth of Croats in Bosnia regions, where the Croats constituted ethnic majority, most of Herzegovina, Central Bosnia and Bosnian Posavina. In other areas, Bosnian Krajina or Turkish Croatia, Sarajevo, Tuzla, the western part of Posavina, the goal was to preserve the Croatian population and help it exercise its rights, while relying on the Croatian state and areas controlled by Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In short, Serbia's policy towards Bosnia was, and remains, trivially clear: to destroy the country statehood and annex as much as possible to Greater Serbia. Muslim Bosniak politics oscillated between two options: unitary Bosnia and Herzegovina, dominated by increasingly Islamized Bosniaks, or partition with the aim of creating a Muslim state on as large a part of Bosnia and Herzegovina as possible. Regarding Croatian politics, there were three options at play: division into three states, internal reorganization of Bosnia and Herzegovina into a confederation of three national states, as well as the third, the union of two states, one of which is a Bosniak-Croat hybrid state, Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. It can be noted that, in addition to American geopolitical goals, the third option was also a sign that Tudjman had not sobered up from Starčević's delusions about Bosnian Muslims as supposedly natural Croatian allies.
The establishment of Dayton, Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the autumn of 1995, with its division of Bosnia into the so-called two entities, the Republic of Srpska and the Bosniak-Croat Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, reminds one of the division of Bosnia and Herzegovina through the Croatian-Serbian Agreement of 1939. In that period it was the Bosnian Muslims who found themselves in a sandwich between the Croats and Serbs. This time, in Dayton, Bosnia, that fate fell upon the Bosnian Croats. The Croats in both entities have been exposed to majority rule, on the one side from the Serbs, and from the Bosniaks or Muslims from the other. Also, there is District Brčko, that makes territorial discontinuity of Republika Srpska. The very complicated Dayton Constitution has so far proved itself damaging for the economy of Bosnia and its culture in general. It has divided the Croats into a Kroatocentric group, with its center in Western Herzegovina, which builds its politics on the accentuation of the Croatian component of the identity of the Bosnian and Herzegovinian Croats, and opportunism toward Republika Srpska, and a pro-Bosniak group, dispersed in central Bosnia, which stresses the Bosnian specificity of the identity of the Bosnian Croats, and, volens nolens, inclines toward the Bosniak majority in the Bosniak-Croat Federation. At the time of the establishment of the Dayton Constitution in Bosnia, a key role was played by international politics. After this politics has shown itself to be damaging, a new initiative of international factors is necessary, in order to open an effective path to the construction of Bosnia as a modern democratic state, with equal individual and collective or ethnic rights for all its citizens. So far, these initiatives have shown that three Bosnian peoples radically differ in their views on identity, history and future, and that Bosnia is sustainable only as a colony, kept by outside global international forces ad infinitum.
Contemporary Bosniaks, Croats and Serbs live in the post-Dayton Bosnia and Hercegovina as three separate national communities which can be seen, among other things, in culture, history, media, social life, economy and education. They use different textbooks, which is evident from dictionaries they use in tertiary education, as well as with textbooks they use in teaching their national and Bosnian histories.